RaceKraft is finally out with their 3076 tri-blade prop. We've been pleasantly surprised recently with the Lumineer tri-blade, so with any luck we'll have another competitive entry in the 3-inch market. Weight-wise, it comes in at 1.6 grams, so it's a little bit heavier than the RotorX that we're going to use as our baseline, but not significantly so. On the test, I'm running this on the RCX 1307 3800 kV on 3S, and unfortunately right off the bat it doesn't exactly blow me away. The RPM you can see we're hitting 31,000, and that's higher than the RotorX is getting, so we've got a lighter load. Unfortunately that comes along with lighter thrust as well, only 257 grams versus 322. So we've got a fairly significant drop, 60 grams or so of thrust down in a static test versus our kind of baseline. The amp draw is likewise down as well, which is good, but unfortunately it's not down enough. And even though our max power is lower, the efficiency is lower as well. If we look at the thrust we get out of 100 watts of power, RotorX is giving us about 201 grams of thrust, while the RaceKraft is only getting us about 179. So we're down about 10% efficiency at the 100 watt point. While we're losing a good amount of thrust at peak, it still is giving us a usable amount. It's more raw power than 3020 biblade, and I would anticipate with its increased pitch that once you get up to speed, you're going to lose less thrust as the prop unloads moving through air. So prop unloading should help its efficiency. Unloading is going to help the RotorX in comparison as well, but unfortunately that's not something that we're in a position to test right now. So in the charts we're looking at the RaceKraft in red and the RotorX, our baseline, in green. Everything in the throttle ramp looks pretty good. We've got a nice flat linear thrust curve through most of the RPM range, and if anything, in the bottom third of the power band, it looks like the RaceKraft prop actually kicks up a little faster proportionally compared to the RotorX, so a little meatier down in the bottom end, even though it's not quite hitting the same numbers. If we look at just the prop's performance, you can really see how the RaceKraft prop is under a lesser load. We're hitting a higher RPM than we are with the RotorX, but throughout the entire RPM range we are hitting lower power for any particular RPM, so this is not as aggressive a prop as the RotorX in this static situation. And we can kind of see that below about 10,000 RPM, the lower third here, we're hitting about 30,000 RPM peak. The graphs diverge a lot less, and then just past that they start to kind of spread apart just a little more. Not a ton of thrust under in this section. I mean, we're only looking at about 25 grams of thrust, so this is going to be, just below your hover point. That this is really picking up quicker. If we look at the efficiency, even though it is a lighter load, it's not giving us great efficiency numbers. We are hitting less peak power compared to the RotorX, only about 165 watts at peak compared to about 185, 186 on the RotorX. But since we make so much less peak thrust, the lack of power draw at peak doesn't end up making up for it. We're pretty close. Lower down, things are not too bad until you get into the about 75 watt range and stuff starts to separate. But we're left with kind of a pretty big performance gap if we compare, like, even just, say 100 watts. We're only pulling about 180 grams of thrust out of the RaceKraft, where for the same 100 watts out of the RotorX prop we get 200 grams. And if you consider, say, grab a 200 gram thrust amount and go across the other way, you can see 200 grams thrust, that's where we're at about 100 watts. But to get the same thrust out of the RaceKraft, we would have to draw 116, 117 watts. So an extra 15% power to get the same thrust. If we look at the acceleration, despite the RaceKraft prop being ever so slightly heavier, it looked like it's actually cutting through the air quite easy. This is a braking zone, and while the RaceKraft, because it was a lighter load, is spinning a higher RPM, you can see that it actually beats out the RotorX prop in the same braking area, brakes faster, crosses over the line and gets to a slower point, and it's at a higher RPM at the lower throttle as well, so then the RotorX eventually catches up again. And you can see this even more clearly if we look at the actual acceleration numbers. This showing both a acceleration and braking section coming from 25% throttle to about 60% throttle. So kind of a mid-sized throttle burst. While the RaceKraft accelerating managed to peak out at about 545 RPM per millisecond, the RotorX only managed about 400 RPM per millisecond. So we're losing about 140 RPM per millisecond in peak acceleration with the RotorX, even though it's a lighter prop. And the same on the braking, the RotorX managing 340 RPM per millisecond, and the RaceKraft getting about 430 RPM per millisecond. So about 100 RPM per millisecond faster than the RotorX baseline. And if we come in even closer, you can see how the RaceKraft peaks up in acceleration much sharper, much quicker, and then tails off sooner as it's already reached its target RPM, where the RotorX has a lower peak and has to drag out a little longer, have higher acceleration for a longer period of time to hit the same target. So the RaceKraft definitely looks like a more agile prop, which I find really interesting. Despite the large blade area, the load is fairly low. The efficiency isn't great, but the load is really low, so it's able to move a lot more freely, to accelerate, decelerate a lot more freely in the air, which is a good benefit. Not a massive difference in time. Like if we look at the time chart, the difference between these two, it's only like 2 or 3 milliseconds at most. So this isn't like in some of the other, when we were comparing loaded versus unloaded, 15, 15, 20 millisecond gap. The gap is much, much smaller, but in terms of absolute acceleration, it's pretty clear.